welcome everyone who will be joining us via YouTube whenever you see this video. It's for the Moorhead Church of Christ Wednesday evening Bible study. We're studying through the book of Judges, and we are in the last section, and it's really been an interesting study. It's called, the last 5 chapters is called the appendices of the book, so we have supplemental material that fits somewhere during the time of the Judges. Don't know where. The author's not concerned about it. Puts it there really to show the spiritual dysfunction and the moral dysfunction of the nation. And we are in that, probably looking at that in these chapters. You'll recall in chapter 19 that a Levite went through passing back from south going north on his way home to Ephraim. He stopped overnight in Gibeah. While he was there, the men of Gibeah rose up, wanted to essentially have sexual relations with him, and that didn't happen. But what did happen is that his concubine, or his wife, was put out there, and the men essentially raped her all night long, and she was let go, came back to the home where they stayed. And when the Levite traveling to Ephraim came out of the old man's house in the morning, he discovered that she was dead. He put her on his animal, his donkey, took her back home, cut her in 12 pieces, sent a piece of her body to each one of the tribes with some kind of message saying, you know, we need to get together and deal with this great atrocity that happened to me at this place. And so chapter 20 is that all of these other tribes minus Benjamin was there, and they decided that they were going to hold the tribe of Benjamin accountable. They demanded that the tribe hand over those men that had committed the atrocity, only to find that the tribe itself refused to do that, and it led to a civil war between all of the tribes of Israel against one tribe, which are the Benjamites. And that's where we're at in our study, resuming our study here in verse 36 of chapter 20. So what we'll do is we'll read 36 to the end of the chapter. Let's see here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So if we can get, Ryan, if you want to read the first 6, and Jenna, if you'll read the last 7 verses, we'll finish the reading off.
I read to 41?
Yeah.
Okay. So the sons of Benjamin saw that they were defeated when the men of Israel gave ground to Benjamin, because they relied on the men in ambush whom they had set against Gibeah. The men in ambush hurried and rushed against Gibeah. The men in ambush also deployed and struck all the city with the edge of the sword. Now the appointed sign between the men of Israel and the men in ambush was that they would make a great cloud of smoke rise from the city. Then the men of Israel turned in the battle, and Benjamin began to strike and kill about 30 men of Israel. For they said, surely they are defeated before us, as in the first battle. But when the cloud began to rise from the city in a column of smoke, Benjamin looked behind them, and behold, the whole city was going up in smoke to heaven. Then the men of Israel turned, and the men of Benjamin were terrified, for they saw that disaster was close to them.
Therefore they turned their backs before the men of Israel toward the direction of the wilderness. But the battle overtook them, while those who came out of the cities destroyed them in the midst of them. They surrounded Benjamin, pursued them without rest, and trod them down opposite Gibeah toward the east. Thus 18,000 men of Benjamin fell, all these were valiant warriors. The rest turned and fled toward the wilderness, to the rock of Rimmon, but they caught 5,000 of them on the highways, and overtook them at Gidom, and killed 2,000 of them. So all of Benjamin who fell that day were 25,000 men who draw the sword. All these were valiant warriors. But 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and they remained at the rock of Rimmon 4 months. The men of Israel then turned back against the sons of Benjamin, and struck them with the edge of the sword, with the entire city with the
So we're going to resume sort of the Civil War and what happened. I failed to mention earlier that what we're reading now is really the third battle. There was 3 battles, and the first 2 were fought between Israel and Benjamin. Who won the first 2? Benjamin did. And then Israel knew that there was some kind of problem. They inquired of God. They offered up burnt offerings and peace offerings, and God actually responded that, hey, you should go up this next time. I'm going to be with you. And so basically they are going to win this battle because God is with them, and God is in favor of them, at least punishing the evildoers that committed the crime in Gibeah. So we're looking at verse 36 there, and sometimes reading through this can get very confusing, but what happens is the author is talking about the same incident. He talks about it, he talks about some other events that goes on there, then he kind of comes back to a point he had been before, and he talks about some other things, and so it can be very confusing trying to keep everything straight. So in verse 35, we need to recognize that that's really a summation of the end of the war between Israel and Benjamin. That happens really, is sort of like one and the same with verse 46. But the author feels it's important at this point to tell us sort of what happened to Benjamin. So in verse 36 it says, so the sons of Benjamin saw they were defeated when the men of Israel gave ground to Benjamin, because they had relied on the men in ambush whom they had set against Gibeah. And so what you have is remember that Benjamin won the first 2 battles. And what happened is the sons of Israel went up to Gibeah. They fought against Benjamin. Benjamin essentially drove them back, and they sort of retreated. Well, the sons of Israel are going to do the same thing again, but this time they have an ambush set up. So men are in hiding out of sight from of the city of Gibeah, and so the sons of Israel are going to, they lose some of their men, they're going to retreat. The sons of Benjamin, or the soldiers, are going to pursue them, and this is done intentionally to draw them further and further away from the city. They think they're going to win another battle. When they get a certain distance away, then the men in ambush are going to come out, and they are going to attack the city, and essentially they're going to burn it to the ground. So this is what we're talking about here. But it says that verse 6, that the sons of Benjamin saw that they were defeated, and that again has to be taken in consideration to what's going to happen once they're word from the city and the ambush takes place. Verse 37 says, the men in ambush hurried, rushed against Gibeah. The men in ambush also deployed and struck all the city with the edge of the sword. And deployed here, the idea of battle formation. And so obviously the army of Benjamin was far enough away for this other force to rush in there and attack the city and overcome it. And verse 38 says, now the point assigned between the men of Israel and the men in ambush was that they would make a great cloud of smoke rise from the city. So think about this from a tactical standpoint. You have these men here, they don't have radios, have no way to respond to these other men that are in ambush. And so it is like, you know what, we're going to lure them away from the city. We're going to act as if sort of they're pursuing us, that we're losing. But we need to know when you guys get in the city and you overcome the city. And so the idea is, as a prearranged signal, you guys sort of set up smoke signals. And we'll be looking for that smoke signal, because when we see the smoke city signal, we're going to turn around and we're going to start attacking these people. And when you guys get done, then you can attack from the rear. And so essentially you're pinning them in between armies in the front and the rear of the whole army there. Any questions about what's happening here in this situation? Okay, if not, we'll go on to 39. It says, Then the men of Israel turned in battle, and Benjamin began to strike and kill about 30 men of Israel. Now this is going back to verse 32, so the author, this is where it gets confusing, and it's talking about the men of Benjamin. Says, surely they are defeated before us as in battle at the first. So the author is sort of retelling some of this stuff, and that's why it makes it sort of confusing. Verse 40 says, so this is kind of continuing what we got before 39. It says, but when the cloud began to rise from the city in a column of smoke, Benjamin looked behind them, and behold, the whole city was going up in smoke to heaven. And so this is kind of goes back to verse 37 or 36, when it said, so the sons of Benjamin saw they were defeated. When they saw they would have been defeated, not when they were chasing off the main body of the soldiers of Israel, but when they realized the city's on fire. In other words, we've got nowhere to retreat to. We're essentially going to be pinned between two groups of soldiers. Verse 41 says, then the men of Israel turned, and the men of Benjamin were terrified, for they saw disaster was close to them. And so the NIV actually reads the first part, then the Israelites counterattacked. And so you realize that you may have won these two other battles, but now this battle is turning against you, and essentially it's probably going to be worse than the two battles that they fought and won against Israel. Verse 42 says, therefore they turned their backs before the men of Israel toward the direction of the wilderness. So they can't go back to the city. The city is destroyed, it's on fire. It says, but the battle overtook them. So we're talking about the sons of Israel pursuing them, overtook them, while those who came out of the cities destroyed them in the midst of them. And so there were probably other cities somewhere around there. The idea is they're going to attack other cities. Verse 48 brings that out. So the idea is these other soldiers are going to come and attack the main force of the Benjaminites. Verse 43, Ryan.
Yeah, I just have maybe a quick question of clarification. So, so it says that the signal would be something about the cloud of smoke. Does that mean they were actually starting the city on fire?
Well, it doesn't appear. It seems like this is a prearranged signal that they were either going to have a smoke signal. That's what the indication is from verse 40. Does that mean that they were going to start the city on fire, or they were just going to start a fire? Oh. But ultimately, the idea is the whole city is being burned. So sometimes the clarity isn't there. Were they supposed to set this other fire just to get things going?
That's what I was thinking.
And then they burned down the whole city, or what? It seems like either could be true. I mean, obviously the city gets burned down. But it could be just the fact they start the city on fire. But 40 leads you to believe that they're supposed to build a fire and send smoke signals. Yeah. So, okay, that's a good question. All right, verse 43, it says about the sons of Israel. They surrounded Benjamin. This is the army, pursued them without rest, trod them down opposite Gibeah towards the east. In other words, they were relentless. They chased them down. And Arthur E. Kundal and Leon Morrison, their Tyndale Old Testament commentary of Judges and Ruth, says here, the fleeing Benjamites headed in an easterly direction unto the way of the wilderness, verse 42, away from the main Israelite force, which was west of them. And so they essentially went after them. The idea of they're treading them down or trotting them down in battle. Verse 44 says, thus 18,000 men of Benjamin fell. All were valiant warriors. And so the idea of valiant, they're physically strong. They're men that are fighting machines. They're elite men. They can fight battles. And essentially, when you lose that kind of chunk of men, especially of the number that they start out with, 26,700, it's not looking too good. They, even when Israel lost some of their troops, I think that worked out to be about a fifth of their troops. Well, this is, you know, this is about 2/3 of their troops right here. So it turns very badly for them. Verse 45 says, the rest turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, but they caught, this is the sons of Israel, caught 5,000 of them on the highways and overtook them at Gidom and killed 2,000. So you basically have two different places where you have two smaller battles that are taking place, and so they kill another 7,000. The rock of Rimmon here, according to Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary, is a rock, and by the way, the word Rimmon means pomegranate. The rock of pomegranate. So it's a rock near Gibeah in the territory of Benjamin. So there's something must be significant about that. There's lots of rocks that can be around there. So it must be some place that was big enough to accommodate them to take some kind of shelter, some kind of area that sort of is significant enough essentially to be named, okay? But obviously that did not help them at all, because in the end they were defeated there. So verse 46 says, so all of Benjamin who fell that day were 25,000 men who draw the sword. All of these were valiant warriors. Now I want you to look at verse 46 and compare it to verse 35 and tell me if you can see a difference there between the two.
100 men.
What's that?
100 men.
100 men. Okay, so now the question becomes, because essentially Bible critics are going to say, here he said 25,100, here he said 25,000, and essentially that is in their book, that is a contradiction. So how would we explain that the Bible writer is not contradicting himself?
Kind of just speaking broadly by saying like,
Okay.
hey, we killed 25,100 or 25, it's just like they weren't being precise
Okay.
as much as they were just saying
Okay.
roughly right around, you know.
Okay, so this is the thing about it is we live in a modern era, and we sort of like exactness, and in ancient times that wasn't a big concern. In other words, when we see verse 35, we're getting more probably the actual total and the idea of it rounding at 100. Why wasn't it 101 or 103 or 113 or whatever? That was probably even rounded to some degree, but we'll probably have a real close number here, whereas in verse 46, the author is just rounding it off to the closest thousands, and so he rounded down. And so Bible critic might not like that answer, but it is a reasonable explanation for the discrepancy between these two verses. Any thoughts or questions about that? Okay, if not, let's get on to verse 47. It says, but 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and they remained at the rock of Rimmon 4 months. So now we have some more men that are going back there, some place of refuge. They're there for another 4 months. So now we've got another sort of math problem. Okay, so if you look back at verses 15 and 16, how many soldiers you come up with? Total.
26,700.
Okay, so Benjamin, the soldiers of Benjamin, 26,700. Now, if we do the math with all the rest of these, so if you essentially take the 25,100 of verse 35, and you add the 18,000 to 5,000 and 2,000, is that a match with what we had in verses 15 and 16 of 26,700? You have to do a little math. You're going to come up short. You're going to be short 1,000 soldiers. So now we got another math problem. The reason why this becomes important is because the Bible critic is going to sort of say, well, here's the Bible writer, he can't even get his own numbers straight. And so he's saying one thing over here, and then he's saying something different over here. So the Bible writer has 1,000 soldiers that aren't accountable. And when you look at verse 47, I should have thrown that in there. When you put that in there, that leaves you 1,000 men short. Okay, so now we got to figure out how we can defend the Bible writer that he is not contradicting himself again. Any thoughts?
I guess just so they're short 1,000 people, or they have 1,000 more than they should have.
They have 1,000. There's 1,000 unaccounted for soldiers. Gotta back up my language. There's 1,000 of them that don't show up in the numbers. When we get here later in chapter 20, when we go back to verses 15 and 16, where's this 1,000? That's a pretty big number off, especially if we're rounding off. You're not going to round off a full 1,000. Okay, so now we have to give some kind of explanation about that. So I'm just going to see if you guys have any thoughts about the 1,000 soldiers that are missing.
But didn't you say before there's not an exact number, between all of these? They're not exact numbers, so they're off 1,000.
Yeah, well, I mean, you can round off to a certain degree, but you can't round off 1,000. That's a little bit too generous. If it's like between 35 and 46, they rounded off 100 men. That's 1,000 men. So that's probably not the best explanation.
I was gonna say maybe those are just the wounded guys.
Well, these are casualties. Okay, so here, when I studied this too, this was a dilemma for me, and I think this is one of the reasons why we study things out, is as I studied it and as I was reading various commentators, one of them had a good explanation. I will share that with you. But this is really the key. Who won the first two battles? Benjamin. Are we supposed to believe that they lost 0 men in those two battles?
No.
You can see what Israel lost, right? The first battle they lost, verse 21, 22,000. And then in the second battle, the second day, in verse 25, they lost 18,000 men. Isn't it reasonable to believe that this is where the other 1,000 men died? It didn't have to be exact. They could have rounded up, maybe it was 898 men. But the idea is this: surely if they enter in battle, they're going to lose some men. And so that seems like a very reasonable explanation. And I'd like to just read this response that I wrote up in relation to that, because Bible discrepancies are things that people hang their hats on. In other words, they don't want to believe Jesus. They don't want to conform to the morality that Jesus advocates and turning away from sin or whatever. What they want to do sometimes is find places in the Bible where they can say, well, you can't believe the Bible, it contradicts itself. They find reasons to not want to do that, and as people that are defenders of the faith, we have to be able to give some kind of an explanation. So I want to just read here what I wrote up in dealing with this. In dealing with Bible discrepancies, we're sometimes left without complete details of a situation. In other words, the author doesn't account for the losses in those other two battles, okay? So this leaves us with an apparent contradiction. That it isn't not actual, but the idea is that it looks like a contradiction. In this situation, all that is required is that the Bible student offer a reasonable explanation or explanations for these discrepancies that very well could have happened. Since we do not have all the missing facts of a situation, we cannot possibly know what the answer is. But if we provide a reasonable explanation, that gives credibility to the scriptures themselves. In other words, if we don't have the missing information, how can we defend the scripture? That doesn't mean there's a contradiction. It means we're lacking the information. But if we come up with a reasonable explanation, that should be sufficient, and that's probably the answer. Any thoughts or questions about that? okay? I'll read from you from one of the commentaries I use to study this book is Kyle and Delitzsch commentary in the Old Testament book of Judges. And here's what they have to say in particular related to what we're talking about here. It says, in the verses referred to, we have simply a statement of the number of Benjamites who fell in the defeat which they sustained on the third day. So they're talking about that discrepancy. All we have to say, okay, whereas the victories which they gained on the first and the second days could hardly have been obtained without some loss on their part. On the contrary, we may confidently assume that they would not lose less than 1,000 men, though these are not mentioned in brief account before us. So I think that sort of, for our benefit, is that we can stand by the Bible. We can essentially, support the idea that the Bible is fully inspired. But we're going to run into times where, the Holy Spirit who inspired the writer doesn't always give all the details, in which we as Christians, of course, we trust what God says. When we don't have all the specifics, that doesn't mean there's a contradiction. It just means some stuff is missing, and we need to just give that reasonable explanation for whatever the account is. So, okay, if there's no thoughts or questions about that, we'll move on to the last verse of verse 48. It says, of chapter 20, which is verse 48. It says, the men of Israel turned back against the sons of Benjamin and struck them with the edge of the sword, both the entire city with the cattle and all they found. They also set on fire all the cities which they found. And so then we're going to see that it isn't just the people in the battle that died. What's happened is that there has been widespread killings after the battle. In other words, they went to all these cities, all these villages, and essentially killed the occupants and burned down the cities. Okay? So when you look at verse 47, all you have left of the entire tribe of Benjamin is going to be those 600 men. That's it. Everybody else has died. And this is where, it's really the ugly aftermath of battle. It was very brutal. It was ugly. Again, we're in these appendices. We're recognizing that the phrase that the Bible writer has used here, that every man did what was right in his own eyes. Did they go overboard in dealing with Benjamin? What would I say? Absolutely. They went well above what they should have done, right?
Yeah, I have two things I was going to say. The first one is, I wonder if they ever found those guys that they went in there for battle for, those that were...
Well, I would say that when they went into Gibeah and they killed everybody there and they burned down the city, there's a pretty good chance that they got them all.
And then the second question is if I'm the Philistines and you're seeing this, that's like the perfect time to look at, they're destroying themselves.
Right.
Go in there and clean up.
Right. And it depends on where this is at. Was it after the Philistines had broke loose from the oppression, the judge? In other words, they were no longer a threat. See, this is where you place this, and so you think, if the Israelites are underdog, they're just making their situation worse. But it seems like this probably would have had to happen at a point where the Philistines were really not a threat. I mean, that seems, like the kind of the worst kind of things you can do. You're making your situation go from bad to worse because you're fighting amongst yourselves. Yeah, Timothy.
Yeah, that's one the question Ryan asked before in verse 40. I think verse 48 has answered that question. I think it's actually they set the city on fire. Yeah, because from verse 48, the last verse told us that they actually went from city to city, burning down those cities. That means what we have, the cloud or smoke that rises in verse 40 was actually, the city was actually set on fire.
Yeah. So you had a second question, Ryan, I thought.
I already asked it.
Okay.
The other, it was
About the Philistines,
yeah,
okay,
yeah.
we're good then. So again, we should not have to be in a position, if somebody takes us to these kind of passages in the Old Testament, we really don't have any explaining to do. Why? Because these are being highlighted as that spiritual and moral dysfunction of the nation. This is the dark ages of the nation of Israel. We don't have an explaining to do. We don't have to explain why they killed men, women, and children, whatever. We weren't there. And it doesn't necessarily mean that God was supportive of that. The author is not essentially adding commentary about whether God approved of it or not. We would assume that all the evils that are done in these 5 chapters were essentially not God approved. And that's why they're being highlighted as really the fact that these people were doing what was right in their own eyes, but they weren't really fully dedicated to God's will. Okay, any thoughts or questions before we get into chapter 41? So 41 is just going to be the aftermath of the battle now. Okay, so now you essentially have defeated the Benjamites. You destroyed all the cities. You destroyed all of the women and the children. You have 600 men left. You see a problem going forward with the tribe of Benjamin if you only have 600 men left? The verge of extinction. I mean, how many more Benjamites are going to be there without women? Just the 600 men. So that comes to reality here as we go through this chapter. So chapter 21 deals with the unfortunate reality of the tribe of Benjamin after the civil war with the sons of Israel. There are only 600 men remaining, an entire tribe. And this tribe is on the verge of an extinction unless Israel does something to prevent this from happening. What I'm saying is that the sons of Israel went overboard. What was the purpose of essentially destroying all of these cities and killing all of these women and children as well? What benefit was that when they punished the sons of Benjamin? They defeated their army. There was no really purpose to go to that extreme. So we're going to read the first 4 verses. Ben, would you be interested in doing that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Now the men of Israel had sworn in Mizpah, saying, "None of us shall give his daughter to Benjamin in marriage." So the people came to Bethel and sat there before God until evening and lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. They said, "Why, O Lord, God of Israel, has this come about in Israel, so that one tribe should be missing today in Israel?" It came about the next day that the people arose early and built an altar there and offered burnt offerings and peace offerings.
All right, very good. So when we think about the situation that just happened between the sons of Israel and the sons of Benjamin, this civil war, I really liked what Matthew Henry said in his commentary of the whole Bible in the book of Judges here. He says, quote, "Those who had spared the Canaanites in many places," this would include the sons of Benjamin as well as all of the other tribes, "those who had spared the Canaanites in many places, who were devoted to destruction by divine command." In other words, God wanted you to go into the promised land, destroy all the Canaanites. So Matthew Henry says, "could not find in their hearts to spare their brethren that were devoted by their own curse." He says, "Men are commonly more zealous to support their own authority than God's." In other words, Matthew Henry is saying they couldn't bring themselves to destroy the real enemies of the nation, but they essentially, in dealing with their own brethren, were overly zealous and essentially almost exterminated the entire tribe. So in verse 1 here, we find some additional information that we didn't have when all of the tribes gathered in Mizpah back in chapter 20 and verse 1, and that is that these guys had made an oath. When they dealt with the sons of Benjamin sometime, maybe after they essentially got beat twice in battle, we don't know, but they made an oath, and the oath was what? Verse 1, what was the oath that the sons of Israel made?
Don't give any of their women in marriage.
We're not giving them any of our daughters. That would be a significant thing. In other words, these guys, we're not happy with them. And essentially, we're going to penalize them. None of our daughters are going to be given to their sons in marriage. So here's the dilemma. If you have 600 men left of the tribe of Benjamin, and you're not giving them any daughters, you can sort of see that the tribe is going to eventually just die off. Jenna.
Are they young men, like 18, 20 years old?
Well, it doesn't really say, but we would think probably men that would fight in battle. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, we've got 600 men left over, and they seem to have fled the battle, so they had to be, my guess would be somewhere between, maybe late teens to maybe 50-ish, close to 50.
They
So-
ran, got away, so they must have been pretty fast. I'd say they're young.
Yeah.
Very well could be, yeah. Okay, so they had made this oath. Why? Because they were really angry with the tribe of Benjamin. And what we see here in verse 2, it says, so the people came to Bethel. We're talking about the sons of Israel. The rest of the tribe had done this. They came to Bethel, sat there before God until evening. So we're talking about by the tabernacle. Remember, the tabernacle went from Shiloh to Bethel. And it says they lifted up their voices and wept bitterly. Now, doesn't this strike you as very strange? Because you guys, you sons of Israel, you guys caused this. You guys went overboard. You went too far in trying to carry out punishment against these people. And it's only now that the realization kicks in that, hey, we got a little bit too carried away. And this is kind of what we see here, because if they can't have any, they're down to 600 men and they can't marry any of the daughters of any of the other tribes, I mean, this is really a very bad situation going forward. Verse 3 says, this is the sons of Israel, the people of Israel. They said, why, O Lord of Israel, has this come about in Israel, so that no one tribe should be missing today in Israel? Okay? And this seems like a very odd question to ask, because they're asking the Lord why this situation came about, and why did the situation come about? Because the sons of Israel not only were going to punish the sons of Benjamin, but they almost seemed like they would have almost wiped them out entirely. So why are they asking the Lord this question when the answer would have been very easy for them to have figured out? And you will notice if you scan down the next few verses that there's no response from the Lord. And you'll recall that this is probably not a good indication in terms on their part, because the Lord says nothing in response to that. Kyle and Delitzsch, their commentary here says, quote, this lamentation involved the wish that God might show them the way to avert the threatened destruction of the missing tribe and to build up the 600 who remained, to give a practical expression to this wish. They built an altar the next morning and offered burnt offerings and supplicatory sacrifices upon it, knowing as they did that their proposal would not succeed without reconciliation to the Lord and a return to the fellowship of His grace. And so they offered up these burnt offerings, as they're mentioned in verse 4. These are an offering that the whole animal is burnt up, the whole thing goes up to God, and it is burnt upon the altar. This is usually offered in relation to sinfulness. And the peace offerings really is a bloody offering presented to God. This is from Nelson's Illustrated Bible Dictionary. Part of the offering was eaten by the priest, representing God's acceptance, and part was eaten by the worshiper and his guests. This sacrifice celebrated covering of sin and forgiveness by God. And the restoration of a right and meaningful relationship with God and with life itself. And so they obviously have some awareness that what they did was wrong, or you would not be offering these kind of sacrifices. Any final thoughts? We don't really have an opportunity to go any further, but when you think about how the relevance of this today, obviously it's difficult to make sort of an exact relevance, but we can sort of see that maybe when we think of some of the relations in the church, the idea that the importance of dealing with sin, the importance of having good relationships within the church, we can recognize that there's counterproductive activity in the church if we are acting heavy-handedly, if we're not in unity with one another. There's a lot of maybe general observations or applications. Anybody else have anything that we might apply?
I think the Bible says, examine yourself to see if you are still in the Lord. I think if the children of Israel actually examine themselves, they won't be praying to God, asking God, why is this happening? When they actually knew the fault is from them. Because Ab initio, when they take the decision to go and fight the Benjamin, God never approved it. They went on their own accord. So why is there the prayer now? Why are they now praying to God? Why is this happening? Or why is Benjamin missing among them? So I think as Christians, it's applicable to us today. Before we actually pray to God, especially when we are in certain problems, asking God, why is this happening? We should try and look inward. That's why the Bible encourages us on a daily basis. We should try and examine ourselves to see. Today, after I've lived my life, go to my workplace, come back home, and I'm about to sleep. What impact have I made? How have I lived my life today? Have I been able to impact people's life? Have I been able to please God? Have I been able to do this? Is God pleased with me today?
No, very good. So, when we think about this situation, remember that God was essentially told him in this third battle, in the final battle, that he would be with them. And when we sort of look at that, and looking at that verse again, where God said he was going to be with them, in verse 28 of chapter 20, he says, the Lord said, go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into your hand. What we can see is the Lord seemed to be absolutely on board on them going up and fighting against Benjamin and conquering the army. Where the Lord is not on board, from all the indications, seeing that they're offering up the sacrifices, is all the stuff that was done after the battle was done. Going to these cities, here's families living there. We're going to go in there, we're going to essentially cut down the occupants, we're going to start the cities on fire. This does not seem to be part of what the Lord said that he was sort of signing off for. He was just going to be with them in battle, and they were going to do that, but it was taken further than what was intended. In other words, there's no good outcome for them to have done what they did, because what they did was create this problem. So they're the ones responsible for almost the extinction of the tribe of Benjamin. So, any other thoughts, comments before we finish up tonight? Appreciate it. Okay, I want to thank those who will be joining us. Whenever you see the YouTube video, Lord willing, a week from today, we'll have another video for you. God bless.